Hey everyone, my name's Kelvin and welcome to my video tutorial here where I'm going to show you how to use the feather brush kit to paint some watercolor feathers. And you can probably follow this tutorial if you have the original watercolor for Procreate, but if you do want these exact brushes, I will put a link in the description down below. So the first thing I'll do is open up a new blank watercolor texture in Procreate, and I've already got the brushes loaded, the feather brush kit up at the top here. I'm going to start by painting the main body of the feather, so I'll choose a sort of a light earthy color, and I'll start with the Splatter Abstract Round brush, and a pretty big size here. Then I'll zoom out and I'll draw the spine of the feather first. Let's make sure the layer is visible first. I'll draw the spine of the feather first like that, and then I'll draw the veins kind of just roughly. It doesn't have to be perfect or anything, and fill it in like that and add some details. And I'll grab the water blender brush here, and I'll just break up some of these hard edges. This ended up being a bit long, so I will cut that off. The next thing I want to do, I want to add some barbs down here. Now, a feather has a spine, and then those little hairs you see on the side of the feather, I guess the technical term for those are barbs. So at the bottom of a feather, the base of a feather, it sort of gets a little bit crazy, and you notice it even has some barbs that are facing the wrong way. So I'm going to do that with the same color I made the main body of the feather. I'm just going to use the light barb liner this time, and I'll just do some lines down here like this, just kind of like little hairs, and then some at the bottom sort of start pointing the wrong way, just like that. And I'll just sort of fill in this area just by kind of scrubbing it a bit there. Now I will use the water blender, again, pretty small this time, and I'll just sort of break up some of those hard edges that I don't like. Okay, that's pretty good. The next thing I'll do is add the spine of the feather. So I'll make a new layer on top of this, and I'll select, I think I'll use the feather vein daughter brush, and then a much smaller or a much darker color here. And I'm going to do a line that's not very even, so I'm sort of pressing it hard and soft, just so I get that kind of interesting variation. And I sort of missed down here, so I'll just rotate that shape there so it lines up with the bottom of the spine a little bit better. I'm going to grab the water blender again, much bigger size this time, and I'm just going to randomly tap around and get some blurriness, kind of some soft edges here on that spine. And then at the very bottom, I'll sort of fade it into the very bottom, the quill here, just like that. I think that looks pretty good, just so it sort of fades in. The next thing I'll do is add the, I guess it would be the texture of the barbs, the sort of lines in the feather. And I'll do that by creating a new layer, but I'm going to put it underneath the spine we just drew, but above the main body of the feather. So I'm going to do the barb texture on this one. And the way I do that is I'll grab the selection tool, and I'm going to make sure it's on freehand, and I'll just try to sort of isolate or select just one vein of the feather, in this case the left vein, just like that. I'll grab the streaky barb liner brush, and I'm going to use it almost at the maximum size, and as long as I have a pretty dark color selected, I can just sort of go down the feather like this and just easily and quickly create that sort of feathery texture, but I'll lighten it up later. I'm going to do the other side the same way. I just deselected it, and now I'll grab the selection tool again, and as long as it's on freehand, I can just select the right vein. And it doesn't have to be perfect. It's okay if it doesn't perfectly line up. There we go. I'll use that same brush, that streaky barb liner, but this time I'm going to do it the other direction. Okay, that looks pretty good. I'll deselect it, and then I'm going to go to the layers panel, and this is the layer we just drew that on. I'm going to set that to multiply, then I'll lower the transparency to 0, and then just start raising it up until I just barely see the texture start to show up. I don't want it to be too overstated. What I'll do now is I'll just pinch these layers together. All three of them, I just merged them into one layer now. So I'm not getting confused by three different layers or which layer I'm on. I'm just going to work on everything now flattened down onto one layer. And what I'll do next is I'm going to modify some of the colors. So in a feather, the very tip of the feather is usually darker and more saturated, and then it fades down, gets less saturated, and sort of more grayish at the bottom. And I can do that by just starting by selecting the tip of the feather like this. I'll feather that selection so it's a bit softer. And then I'll go to the adjustments here, hue, saturation, and brightness. I'll darken it just a tiny bit, but I'll really crank up the saturation. And then if you shift the hue, you can sort of shift it to maybe a little bit of a more suitable color, a little bit redder color in this case. Now I've got the saturated tip and the mid-tone. Now I need to do the sort of lighter desaturated area down here. So I'll grab that selection tool again and just make a kind of V-shaped selection at the bottom of the feather. I'll feather that one out to soften it. I'll go to my adjustments here and use the same one, hue, saturation, and brightness. But this time I'll brighten it up just a little bit and I'll desaturate it quite a bit there so you can see it's fading now. But this is still too warm. I think it looks better when the gray is a little bit of a bluish gray, not such a warm gray. So I'm going to use the hue slider and find a kind of a blue color like that. And I'll desaturate it a lot more. There we go. Then I will deselect it to apply the changes. So all I've done here is I've sort of made the tip of it a little darker and more saturated. It goes and fades down to this sort of mid color. And then down here it fades to a bluish gray color. And I like the way that looks. Now I want to make this a little bit fluffier. So I'm going to grab my barb plumage blender down here. And I'll set that pretty small, something like that. And I'm just going to sort of go in with these little barbs down here and use this blender, and it just sort of automatically gives it this sort of fluffy, fuzzy effect. And you can also sort of zoom out, make it a little bit bigger, and sort of go in at the edge of the feather along the border here and add some details like that. There we go. This feather's almost done. What I want to do next is add some splits. So I'm going to grab my eraser and I'm going to set the brush to the feather vein dotter. And maybe pretty small is good. And I'll just go in there. Starting at the spine, I'll press harder and harder until I go out the side of the feather and then kind of round that edge. And I'll just do that in a few random places. But you don't always have to start at the spine. You can start a little bit further out. And just make sure you always round the exit of that split. There we go. I'm really happy with this. I think I just want to add some speckles on this feather to add some texture. So I'll create a new layer above everything. And I've already got a pretty dark color selected, but I think I'll shift it to kind of a bluish tone. I'll grab my speckles brush, maybe at medium size. I'll just go over the feather like that. Just add some speckles. Then I'll set this layer to multiply. And then using my eraser brush, I'll kind of clean up the edge where the speckles got a little bit over the edge of the feather there. There we go. And if you want to adjust the intensity of this texture, you can always just sort of lower the opacity until you get what you want. Now, as with all of my textures and all of my watercolor kits, you can turn off the paper background if you want to export this and save it as like a kind of a stock image or ultimately turn it into a PNG image. You can just turn off the background by going inside the watercolor texture folder, on-off paper background. Just uncheck that. And you'll see it doesn't affect the feather, it just switches off the texture back here, which will make it easier to isolate it and use it for another project. So there we go. Hopefully that explains how to use the feather brush kit. And I will be adding more tutorials on how to paint different feathers, and I'll put links to those in the description. But other than that, guys, thank you so much for your support. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.